Welcome everyone to this Veitch Listed Consulting video. I have with me Stuart Donovan, our resident economist and land use planning guru. My name is Michael Roth. I do the transport policy work. Today, we're here to discuss the new national policy statement on urban development announced in New Zealand. It's got many transport planners and policymakers excited. Stu, quickly, what have they announced?
Well, I think it is very exciting, I guess, which is why we're here. There's two key planks to this policy, I think, which are really worth discussing in depth. One is the upzoning of development around rapid transit, where the policy requires a minimum height limit of 6 stories within walking distance of existing and planned rapid transit. So it's actually enabling intensification in advance of the infrastructure being provided. The second policy plank, which I think is really exciting, is the nationwide removal of minimum parking requirements from all urban areas with populations greater than 10,000 people. As far as we know, that's the most comprehensive reforms of parking policies in the world, from what we can tell.
Wow. Yeah. But everyone wants to park at the front door and no one wants to pay. I mean, to paraphrase Donald Shoup, free parking comes at a high cost. Parking changes are really difficult. What could these policy changes achieve?
Yeah, you're right. It is really difficult. And I think there's a couple of things to comment on there. One is the difficulty of those parking changes is why central government in New Zealand decided to take this approach of mandating these changes at a national level. So there were some local governments in New Zealand who went ahead of the curve and moved to remove minimums from quite large areas. The central government has observed those challenges and difficulties. That they were successful with their changes, but it was difficult and quite a long process. The central government has stepped in here and said, we think this is a good idea and we're going to require it nationwide, basically simplifying the process for a lot of councils. I think the other thing about the parking changes is in recognition of the complexities for councils is that it gives them an 18-month lead-in time before these changes come into effect. So it's not like the minimums are removed overnight. This policy signals that they are to be removed within the next 18 months, and that time period gives councils the opportunity to scale up their parking management policies and make sure that people can still park conveniently when and where they need it.
Okay, well, here in Brisbane, we had a parking task force several years ago, and it made a few changes, but they were at the margins. So they did not change on-street or off-street parking significantly. And more recently, we've probably gone backwards a little bit with mandated parking requirements for some residential developments. How did New Zealand get to this place where you can change the game so much?
Yeah, I think it's a story that goes back a couple of decades and it involves a lot of people in a lot of different organizations basically working on this issue and progressing it. If you go back to the late 90s, in Auckland and Wellington, the two largest cities in New Zealand, removed minimum parking requirements from their city centres. They did that to stimulate land use development in those city centres, which were perceived to be struggling. Those policy changes were broadly successful. They also required councils to experiment, to work on their parking management policies, rather than just rely on minimums to sort out the issues for them. Is that the councils actually had to start pricing parking on street in the city centre and being a little bit more involved. And once again, they learned a lot from that process. This is not an experience that it's been sort of unique to New Zealand. Other cities overseas have experienced similar issues. San Francisco led a lot of work on exploring parking demand management, and Auckland and Wellington have learnt from that experience. So that's got us to a point about 10 years ago where people were asking what comes next. And I think into that vacuum, there's been a lot of leadership shown by a couple of people. One of the people who was heavily involved about a decade ago as a consultant and a researcher, Julianne Genter, she subsequently became Associate Minister for Transport. So she's obviously been able to push these issues at a broad level with a lot of people, including political parties from across the spectrum. So that's in a nutshell. That's how we got to this point. But it really has been a team effort.
It's great to see New Zealand moving to a market model, letting the market decide rather than the command and control approach that we seem to adopt and force developers to pour lots of concrete for parking. So what happens next to prepare for these changes and to maximise the benefits from them? Bearing in mind, some pointers perhaps for Australian cities.
Yeah, it's a good question. So as I said, councils now have about 18 months to 2 years to get their house in order to scale up their response to these policy changes. I think the real lesson for Australia is in New Zealand, the driver for these policy changes was urban development and particularly issues with housing affordability. Those same issues apply to a lot of Australian cities that are grappling or have been grappling with quite rapid population growth. And so that was the driver in New Zealand. It wasn't a question so much about the transport system. There are some transport benefits in the long run if you manage your parking well. But the real driver is urban development and housing affordability. I think the other lesson for Australian cities is really to try and link your parking policies to evidence and experience. So a big emphasis in the New Zealand reform so far is that we are removing minimum parking requirements and we are pricing parking, but we're doing so to ensure that you can find a car park conveniently when and where you need it. So we want to provide you with convenient car parking. It might not be free, but we're only going to charge as much as we need to make sure that that there is a car park available when and where you need it. So that emphasis on convenience, I think, that's the goal of a lot of these reforms, is something that Australian cities could learn from, I think.
Fantastic initiative. Thank you, Stuart. Hopefully we get some good data out of this and we see how New Zealand adopts it. We want to keep this short, so we will call it quits. For listeners out there, if you want us to do more videos or if you've got questions, please contact Stuart or myself. Bye for now.
Thank you.